Have you ever wondered why you still think about them? Long after the calls stopped, the texts faded, and everyone told you to move on. It hits you in the quiet moments. A song, a scent, a silence too loud to ignore. This isn't just nostalgia. It's something deeper, something your soul is trying to tell you. Carl Jung believed these lingering thoughts aren't about them. They're about you. In the next few minutes, we'll uncover the hidden reasons you can't let go, and what it truly means to set yourself free. Stay with me. This might change the way you see everything. Chapter 1. The Midnight Whisper. In a quiet farmhouse on the outskirts of Vermont, nestled among the maples and hidden beneath the hush of a long October night, Emily lay still beneath a quilt her grandmother once stitched by hand. The only sound was the soft creak of old wood and the faint drip of rain from the porch roof. Shadows danced gently on the ceiling, swayed by wind slipping through cracked window panes, and the memory of something she couldn't name. She told her friends she was fine. She even believed it most days. She woke up, went to work at the library, made herself tea with lavender and honey, and never once texted him. That had to count for something. But at night, especially on nights like this, the truth crept in like fog over the fields. His name wasn't spoken, but it lived somewhere in her chest. It stirred during the in-between hours, in that fragile space between the world's noise and sleep's surrender. It wasn't just memory. It was something far more subtle, far more haunting. Sometimes it was a jazz tune humming overhead while she picked apples at the market, the same tune they danced to once in a Nashville dive bar. His hands on her hips, hers tangled in his coat collar. Other times, it was the scent of damp earth and pipe smoke, which he never smoked but always lingered on his clothes, like a story without a beginning. She didn't cry anymore. The tears had dried up like autumn ponds. What remained wasn't grief. It was something quieter, something that wrapped itself around her ribcage like ivy. Nostalgia, perhaps? But no. This was deeper than longing. It was rooted, tangled, alive. Carl Jung once said that the thoughts which return uninvited are never random. That the people who keep reappearing in your mind aren't just memories, but messengers, symbols of something deeper, something unresolved. So maybe, Emily thought, it wasn't him she missed. Maybe it was what he stirred in her. The way he made her feel seen, the way he made her believe there were still pages left in her story. Maybe he wasn't the love of her life. Maybe he was the echo of something she had forgotten to become. Outside, the wind sighed through the trees like an old lullaby, and Emily turned toward the window, toward the ache she no longer tried to silence. Chapter 2. What the soul keeps remembering. Jung believed that nothing in the unconscious was random, not a fleeting dream, not the echo of a name, and certainly not the unshakable image of someone who once held your hand and then slipped away. In the heart of a November afternoon, Chicago pulsed around Marcus, horns blaring, trains rumbling overhead, the wind carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts from a street cart nearby. But none of that registered. His steps moved on muscle memory alone, tracing the same sidewalks he and Elena used to wander when love felt effortless, like breathing. It had been almost 2 years. She'd moved to another city, maybe another life. He'd stopped checking. Or at least that's what he told himself. Yet here he was, outside the old bookstore on North Clark Street, hands in his pockets, standing in front of the frosted window like a man waiting for a ghost. He didn't miss her exactly. Not her voice, not her stories about childhood summers in Michigan, not even the way she used to rest her chin on his shoulder during movie nights. What haunted him wasn't the loss of her, it was the loss of what she reflected. When she laughed, something in him softened. When she cried, something in him surfaced. Elena had this way of holding a mirror to his insides, showing him who he could be if he wasn't so afraid to try. That kind of reflection stays long after the photos are deleted, long after the number is erased. Jung called it psychic resonance, the soul's recognition of something it's been trying to name. Elena wasn't just a person, she was a symbol of his hunger to be seen, of the tenderness he buried beneath sarcasm, of the man he almost became before he let fear close the door. So Marcus walked, not to follow her footsteps, but to retrace his own, to remember what it felt like to be cracked open by something real. And as the sky turned slate gray and the snow began to fall, he realized the ache wasn't about her absence. It was about the part of himself that still stood in that winter light, waiting to be understood. Not by her, but by him. Because what the soul keeps remembering, it keeps for a reason. Chapter 3. The Mirror That Never Lies. Projection isn't poetry, it's psychology. But the lines between the two blur when you're in love with a person who, in truth, is a reflection of everything you've hidden from yourself. You think it's magic. You call it fate. But sometimes it's just the mind holding up a mirror, asking, "Do you see this part of you yet?" Lena taught English at a small high school tucked between the pine-covered hills of Eugene, Oregon. Her days were filled with worn paperbacks, essays scrawled in red ink, and the soft creak of chalk on old blackboards. She lived quietly, predictably, almost invisibly. She knew how to follow rules. She knew how to keep her voice low and her dreams smaller still. And then came Caleb. He crashed into her life like a summer storm, unannounced, electric, and impossible to ignore. He wore leather jackets in July, played the guitar like it was an extension of his soul, and talked about road trips and bonfires and things that sounded like songs she used to love before she forgot how to dance. She fell hard. Of course she did. But it wasn't really him she loved. Not the messy apartment or the way he sometimes vanished for days without explanation. It was what he represented: freedom, wildness, a life lived without apology. Caleb was the embodiment of the part of Lena she had buried long ago. The girl who once dreamed of driving down the Pacific Coast Highway with the windows down and no destination. The one who wanted to write novels, not just teach them. He stirred that girl awake. Jung would say she wasn't falling for a man. She was falling into projection, the unconscious act of casting one's own unlived life onto another. Lena wasn't enchanted by Caleb's soul. She was responding to the unclaimed parts of her own. And so, when he finally left, for real this time, no dramatic exit, just silence. What broke her wasn't his absence. It was the recognition that he had never truly been hers to begin with. He was the mirror. And when she looked into it, she didn't see him. She saw herself, wild, radiant, and long forgotten. And that was the beginning of her becoming. Chapter 4. The Fire They Awakened. Sometimes it isn't love that keeps you tethered. It's the wound they awakened. Obsession has a way of dressing itself in romance, sweetening its sting with memories and maybes. But what lingers in the silence after they leave is rarely about them. It's about what they touched in you. David lived on the edge of downtown Austin, in a loft filled with records and half-written poems. He was the kind of man who noticed the weight of dusk in the sky and the way strangers spoke to their dogs on park benches. Sensitive, thoughtful, guarded. He met Camille at a friend's rooftop party one June evening, just after a thunderstorm had rinsed the city clean. She wore a red dress and smelled like gardenias. She talked about philosophy and road trips to New Mexico, and he was undone before the first hour passed. She wasn't perfect. She was unpredictable, inconsistent. She'd disappear for days, then show up with sunflowers and stories that never quite added up. But she made him feel seen. Not for his achievements, not for his charm, but for something deeper, something raw. And then, as quickly as she arrived, she left. No warning, no explanation. Just a voicemail that said, "I'm sorry, I can't do this." He didn't cry, not at first. He just unraveled. He played the songs they used to hum together. He walked past the coffee shop where they once talked for hours. He reread their old text messages like scripture. But what haunted him wasn't the absence of her. It was the echo of something far older. When David was 9, his mother left in the middle of the night. No note, no goodbye, just an empty chair at breakfast and the kind of silence that wounds a boy permanently. Camille's departure didn't break him. It reopened a fracture that had never healed. Carl Jung would say it wasn't Camille his mind was chasing. It was the part of himself that still needed to feel worthy of staying. His mind wasn't missing her. It was aching for understanding, for closure, for a moment in time when someone left and the story wasn't cut short. Camille lit a fire. But it wasn't love that burned. It was memory. The kind that lives not in the heart, but in the bones. The kind that doesn't seek reunion, but healing, and maybe finally peace. Chapter 5. Archetypes in the Attic. Carl Jung believed we don't just fall in love with people, we fall into patterns, invisible ones, written not in ink, but in emotion. We are drawn again and again to those who echo the emotional maps carved into us before we ever knew what love meant. These are the archetypes in our attic, silent, persistent, and profoundly familiar. Lucas was a sculptor who lived in Asheville, North Carolina, in a sunlit studio above an old bakery. His hands were always dusted with clay, his soul quietly bruised. He was the kind of man who loved deeply, but not easily. And more than once, he found himself pulled toward women who felt strangely familiar, warm, artistic, elusive, just like his mother. She had been the center of his world growing up, a painter with untamed curls and a voice that always felt a little too far away. She loved him, he knew that, but she was often lost in her own storms, drifting through moods and canvases and half-promises. One moment tender, the next distracted, unreachable. And so, without ever intending to, Lucas spent his adult life chasing that same rhythm. Not her face, but her energy, her mystery, the ache of wanting more and never quite reaching it. There was Julia, who read Rilke at midnight and left without warning after 9 months, and Ava, who touched his face like he was breakable and then disappeared into a poetry residency out west. Each time, he thought this was it. Each time, he was left with dust on his palms and questions in his chest. Jung would have told him, it wasn't them he was loving. It was the mother archetype they awakened. The unresolved longing, the old dance of reaching and retreating, the hunger for a woman who would finally stay. Archetypes aren't curses, they're calls to awareness. But until we name them, until we open the attic door and dust off the truth, we're doomed to live the same story, wearing different faces. Lucas finally saw it one rainy morning, standing in front of a sculpture he'd titled "Still Reaching." It wasn't a woman he'd carved. It was a memory, and now that he knew its name, he could finally stop chasing it and start sculpting something real. Chapter 6. The Wound That Won't Let Go. Some wounds don't bleed. They echo. If someone still haunts your thoughts long after they've walked away, it isn't always about love. Sometimes it's about the question they left behind, the one you still can't answer. That's the thing about pain. It doesn't need to be sharp to be unbearable. Sometimes it's quiet, lingering, unfinished. In Savannah, Georgia, the spring air was thick with jasmine and regret. Claire lived in a pale yellow house with shuttered windows and a porch swing that creaked when the wind shifted just right. She was 31, with a gentle voice and eyes that always seemed to be searching for something, though she never said what. 3 years had passed since Daniel. 3 whole years. And yet, some nights, when the world was soft and her hands were tired, she'd unlock that old phone and read his last messages, not to feel closer, not to hope, but to study the wreckage. She would zoom in on the punctuation, the timing, the casual way he said, "I just don't think we're right for each other." As if she'd been a misstep, not a woman. As if love had been a weather pattern they couldn't control. Claire didn't want him back. She wasn't delusional. She knew he wasn't her forever. But she couldn't let go of the ache. The question, why wasn't I enough? Carl Jung said that what we resist persists. And Claire had resisted the truth for a long time, that it wasn't Daniel who held power over her thoughts. It was the wound he touched, the old scar from a father who walked out when she was 8, never turning back. The echo of teachers who said she was bright but distracted, of friends who chose others. Every small abandonment layering over the last. Daniel didn't create the wound. He simply reopened it. And so her mind held on, not because it wanted him, but because it needed resolution. Closure, a story with an ending. But some stories don't end with answers. They end when we stop needing them. One night, as thunder rolled over the marsh and rain began to fall against the porch, Claire didn't reach for the phone. She just listened. To the storm, to her breath, to the sound of a wound that, maybe, was finally beginning to close. Chapter 7. The Shadow Beneath Your Smile. There's a part of you that lives in the dark, not because it's evil, but because it was never invited into the light. Carl Jung called it the shadow. All the parts of yourself you've pushed aside, denied, or quietly buried beneath the surface of who you were told to be. You don't meet your shadow in a therapist's office. You meet it in the people who make you flinch, in the habits you can't break, in the ache that never quite leaves, and most of all, in love. In the dry gold stillness of Arizona, where the desert breathes its heat through the bones of old canyons, there lived a man named Reed. He was a builder by trade, stone, wood, and steel, and yet when it came to the architecture of his own heart, he was always in ruins. Reed had a pattern. Every woman he ever fell for was emotionally unavailable, married, wounded, restless, and always, always out of reach. He told himself he liked the chase, that he was drawn to complicated souls. But the truth was simpler and far sadder. They were all echoes of his own shadow. Reed had grown up with a mother who was gentle but distant, always humming to herself in another room, locked inside her own melancholy. He learned early that love was something you reached for, but never fully touched. Something you earned, not received freely. And so, without meaning to, he kept choosing women who mirrored that emptiness. Women who stirred the part of him he'd never dared to face. The fear of being truly known, truly seen, truly loved. The shadow doesn't show up in your smile. It hides in the spaces between your relationships. It whispers through the silence after every goodbye. It pulls you toward people who feel familiar, not because they're right, but because your pain recognizes theirs. Reed's lovers weren't mistakes. They were messengers, each one pointing him inward, asking him to look at the part of himself that believed he wasn't worth real love, the part that ran every time someone got too close. And one day, after another goodbye that left him staring at his own reflection in a cracked bathroom mirror, he finally asked the question he'd spent years avoiding. What part of me keeps choosing distance over closeness? Because the shadow doesn't go away. It waits for you to stop running and finally turn toward it. Chapter 8. Integration is the key. There comes a moment, quiet, often private, when you stop asking why they hurt you and start asking what part of you allowed it. It isn't a moment of blame. It's the beginning of something more powerful. Integration. The tender, painful art of gathering your scattered pieces and calling yourself whole again. Joy lived in Brooklyn, in a third-floor walk-up where ivy curled stubbornly around the rusted balcony railings. The apartment was small, cluttered with thrifted books and dried lavender, but it was hers. For the first time in a long time, so was her silence. After Marcus left, she did all the things the world says to do. Blocked his number, deleted the photos, filled her calendar with dinners and distractions. But the ache remained. Not sharp, just steady, like a whisper under the surface of everything. One Sunday afternoon, with rain tapping on her window and nowhere to be, she pulled out a yellow legal pad and began to write. The letter was never meant to be sent. That wasn't the point. It was about hearing herself, maybe for the first time in years. She wrote about the way she had dimmed her laughter so his ego could shine. About the nights she agreed to things she didn't want, just to keep the peace. About how small she became, trying to be loved by someone who only knew how to take. But the most honest part of that letter wasn't about him at all. It was about her. The version of herself she abandoned, the woman with boundaries and dreams and an unshakable light. The woman she used to be before she mistook compromise for devotion. Jung taught that healing doesn't happen through revenge or forgetting. It happens through recognition, through calling back the parts of ourselves we gave away too easily. That letter, messy and tear-stained, wasn't closure. It was resurrection. When Joy put down the pen, something inside her shifted. She wasn't waiting for his apology anymore. She didn't need him to understand. She needed her to return. Integration doesn't mean erasing the past. It means owning it, every choice, every silence, every inch you gave away, and then, piece by piece, taking it all back, not with bitterness, but with grace. Because the journey forward begins where you stopped abandoning yourself. Chapter 9. Individuation, becoming whole again. Letting go doesn't mean you erase the memory or pretend the love never mattered. It means you take back the pieces of yourself you left behind in the process of trying to be enough for someone who never truly saw you. Carl Jung called this process individuation, not a break, but a return. A journey back to the self that existed before the ache. In Denver, where the mountains met the sky like an old love letter, Tony lived alone in a brownstone filled with books and quiet. After a lease, he told himself he was fine. He went to work. He hit the gym. He smiled at friends when they asked how he was doing. But grief, the kind that changes you, doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits patiently on your chest every morning before the coffee brews. Sometimes it follows you into the places where you used to laugh. Elise hadn't broken him. She hadn't even betrayed him. She had simply left, gently, but completely. And what haunted Tony wasn't her absence, but what he'd poured into her presence, his tenderness, his need to be understood, the poems he wrote in his head but never shared. For months he chased closure like it was a destination. Maybe if she explained, maybe if she regretted, maybe if she called. But she didn't, and somewhere in the stillness, he realized he wasn't really chasing her. He was chasing the part of himself he had given away. So, one evening, under the soft glow of a desk lamp and a half-empty glass of red wine, Tony opened a leather-bound notebook and wrote the first poem he'd written in years. It wasn't about Elise. It was about him, his fears, his hopes, his silence, finally speaking. And in that moment, with ink staining his fingertips and truth rising from the page, he felt something shift. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was homecoming. Jung believed that individuation is the process of becoming whole, not by adding more, but by remembering what was always yours. The voice you silenced, the dreams you postponed, the softness you called weakness. Tony didn't need closure, he needed expression. And with each poem, each breath of his own becoming, he wasn't letting go of her. He was letting go of the version of himself who needed her to feel complete. Chapter 10. The Final Turn Inward. They were never meant to stay. They were meant to stir, to awaken, to point you toward the parts of yourself still waiting to be seen. Carl Jung said the ghosts we chase are rarely the people we've lost, but the selves we've forgotten. The wounded child, the silenced dreamer, the fierce, unclaimed voice buried beneath the ache. So when their name floats into your thoughts like a leaf on still water, don't flinch, don't shove it away. Breathe. Ask gently, what is this moment asking me to remember? Not about them, but about me? Maybe it's your courage, maybe your softness, maybe the belief that love is still possible, especially from within, because the end of longing isn't forgetting, it's finding. Finding the version of you who no longer needs someone else to feel whole. And in that quiet return, beneath the noise of memory and regret, you'll hear it. The sound of your soul finally coming home.